Hello and welcome to my podcast where I discuss the origins of all sorts of things. I'm your host, Danny Payne, and this is On the Origin of Everything. Today I'm talking about barbershops. We can recognize a barbershop anywhere. The open floor concept with symmetrical stations, the big barber chairs on checkered tile flooring, an overall utilitarian, industrial, rugged aesthetic, the big glass storefront windows with vintage signage, and the iconic barber pole. You can spot them from a mile away. Based on their intentional throwback appearance, it's reasonable to assume that barbershops began in a distant past, perhaps the early 1900s, or maybe even the 1800s. Well, if you listened to our episode on advertising, you might recall that barber poles have been around since the Middle Ages. That gives us a clue that barbershops have been around at least that long. But would you believe me if I told you that barbershops have been around since ancient Greece, making them 2,500 years old? And would you believe me if I told you that the trade of barbering dates back even further? Well, you better believe it, because barbering is one of the world's oldest professions, and the earliest evidence of this trade comes to us from ancient Egypt. Humans have had a need for personal grooming since the beginning. For tens of thousands of years, we have been cutting our hair with super sharp rocks, sometimes with seashells, and more recently with shears and scissors. For as long as we have had hair, we have had to manage it. It's possible that cutting hair as a profession could have existed among all civilizations, but the earliest mention of hair cutting as a specific job performed as a service appears in ancient Egypt, some 5,000 years ago. Barbers were an essential part of Egyptian society, so much so that their services appear in tomb scenes. In one tomb from the 5th dynasty, a relief shows barbers shaving heads, faces, and bodies. Another relief shows a barber holding a client's head with one hand and shaving their face with the other. There was a lot of shaving going on in ancient Egypt. Shaving was both a practical defense against lice and a ritual act of purity. Egyptian priests shaved regularly to keep the temples of their gods uncontaminated. Centuries later, the Hebrew scriptures would treat hair the same way, as a visible sign of holiness, mourning, or judgment. The Torah gives priests special rules about hair and beards to distinguish them as a consecrated class. A Nazirite would let their hair grow as an outward sign of a temporary vow of consecration and would cut their hair at the end of their vow's duration to make holiness visible through this ritual. The prophet Ezekiel is commanded to shave and divide his hair to symbolize famine and exile. Shaving here communicates divine judgment and loss of covenant status with God. There are a lot of verses in the Bible about hair cutting, and the one in Ezekiel even uses the word barber specifically. In Genesis 41:14, Joseph shaves before appearing in front of the Pharaoh, reflecting Egyptian grooming norms. So, in Egypt, priests shaved to maintain ritual purity, and in Israel, the Levitical laws likewise regulated hair and beard as markers of holiness. Both traditions use hair as a visible code of religious identity, even as the specifics differ. All of this is to demonstrate that barbering has been an important service since biblical times and earlier. Ancient Greece is where we find the first barbershops. Not in the exact form as we know them to be, but close enough, at least in their function. What we know about them comes solely from literature, especially comedies of that era in which the barber is repeatedly characterized as a talker, and their koureon, or barbershops, were described as public spaces in which to hang out and chat about news and scandals. Sound familiar? Getting a trim while discussing current events and gossiping has been a hallmark of the barbershop experience, apparently since 400 BCE, or thereabouts. Greek barbering was a practical service shaped by tool availability as well. Combs, razors, and mirrors were not owned by everyone, making barbering an important service in Greek society, while their shops functioned as a social hub. The Greek barbershop theme continued into the Roman Empire and became a bigger urban institution. It's possible that the first barbers in Rome were actually Greek, bringing their expertise first to Sicily specifically. But whatever its precise route into Roman culture, by the time evidence of barbering shows up in sources, Rome already had a recognized barber profession with its own Latin vocabulary and an obvious footprint in daily life. Their barbers were called tonsors, or tonstresses, with tonstrina being the Latin word for barbershop. Tonsors and tonstresses were described as doing the familiar services of hair cutting, beard trimming, and shaving, but also manicures. Those fingernails needed attention too, I guess. But what about the Roman barber shops, the tonstrinas? What did they look like? Well, we don't have photos, of course, or blueprints, or any physical remnants to go on, but literary references suggest an open, street-facing shop where people would, of course, get trimmed and shaved, but also linger. They were a space that lent itself to conversation. As time went on, barbershops became quite prosperous, occupying elegant spaces, equipped to look impressive with large mirrors, elevating the trade to something like a status and style business. Barbers during the Roman Empire did pretty well for themselves. From what I've seen, this may have been the golden age for barbers in terms of wealth. They were considered part of the rich class. I imagine that some barbershops today make pretty good money, but no one automatically assumes that barbers are rich by any stretch of the imagination. We don't hear conversations like, "So, what do you do for work?" "I'm a barber." "Whoa, okay, Richie Rich." Yeah, no one's talking like that today. But back in ancient Rome, barbers were ballers. As the Roman Empire spread through Europe, they introduced the areas that they conquered to barbershops and barbering services. They show up in public spaces and in monasteries. Monks in monasteries kept barbers on staff to provide tonsure maintenance. Let me explain these terms. A monastery is a communal religious house where monks live, pray, work, and care for the sick. Tonsure is the ritual shaving of part of the scalp marking monastic or clerical status. If the word tonsure sounds like tonsor to you, it's because they're etymologically related. They come from the same Latin root word tondere, meaning to shear or clip. So where did we get the term barber from? Barber comes from the Latin barba, which means beard. That's still the word for beard in Spanish, barba. This is one of those moments where I couldn't believe that as a Spanish speaker myself, I had never made the connection between the English word barber and the Spanish word barba. Duh. Come on, Danny. But anyway, barbers in monasteries during the Middle Ages were regularly performing religious head shavings on monks called tonsures. There were different tonsure styles ranging from a full head shave to shaving only parts of the head. The one I remember seeing is the Roman tonsure, which shaves the top of the head, leaving a ring of hair that looks like a crown, symbolizing the crown of thorns placed on Jesus' head at his crucifixion. All versions of tonsure represented religious devotion and a renunciation of worldly life. That's what barbers in monasteries were tending to full time. Now, medieval monasteries weren't just spiritual centers. They were also healthcare centers for their own communities. Monks were basically practicing medicine, performing minor surgeries, tooth extractions, lancing abscesses, setting fractures, and bloodletting. Yes, bloodletting. At that time, it was believed that the removal of blood rebalanced the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought that some illnesses were a result of having too much blood, so bloodletting was a standard treatment. What does any of this have to do with barbers, you might be asking? Well, some important changes to a monk's responsibilities occurred, leading to what is commonly known as barber surgeons. Ecclesiastical rulings from the Council of Tours in 1163 and from the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 prohibited monks from cutting, burning, and the shedding of blood. These councils aimed to address the problem of monks neglecting their religious obligations in favor of pursuing medical training, attending university lectures, and focusing too much on medicine as a worldly career. This new limitation on monks' duties didn't eliminate the need for providing treatment. it shifted who did the hands-on work, and barbers, already present to maintain tonsures, increasingly became the practitioners for those procedures that the monks were suddenly forbidden to perform. So from around the 11th century, barber surgeons were common and persisted in various forms into the 19th century. All the way into the 1800s, you guys. Crazy stuff. Barbers going from shaving heads to having to also perform surgeries from some restructuring of responsibilities reminds me of working in corporate America. You have your clearly defined duties, and then a bunch of people get fired, and suddenly you're having to do double or triple the work to pick up the slack for the same wage. I hope those barbers got raises, man. You want me to do what? Lance an abscess? And put leeches on people? I'm gonna need compensation. Hopefully that's how that went. But I doubt it. I did say that barber surgeons were around well into the 1800s, and that's true in certain regions. But in London, the combined profession was formally split in 1745 by an Act of Parliament separating barbers and surgeons into two separate and distinct corporations, marking a major turning point toward modern surgery. Good thing, because I can only imagine how susceptible to infection these barber surgeon procedures were. Yikes. Let's take a break right here, and when I come back, I'll continue the evolution of this very important trade from the barber surgeon era to the modern age of barbering. And what about that barber pole? Stay with me. This episode is brought to you by nothing. To help keep ads off this show, click the Patreon link in the show notes to donate, or go to patreon.com/ontheoriginofeverything. If you find value in all the good information you're getting from this podcast, and you're learning a lot like I am, share it with a friend and help us grow our audience. A 5-star rating and review goes a long way too. Let's build a community of people that are curious and always learning. Thanks for your support, and now back to the show. Barber poles arose out of the Middle Ages as a traditional shop sign. It was an effective way to signal which shop was the barbershop at a time when illiteracy was prevalent. That striped pole was highly recognizable by everyone, but why are they red and white? And why is it a pole? The pole, or staff, is commonly explained as representing the stick that a patient gripped during bloodletting. The red represents blood, and the white represents bandages. Have you ever seen barber poles with the additional blue stripe, though? In Europe, the classic pole is often just red and white, but in the United States, barber poles are red, white, and blue. We're not really sure why or when the blue stripe was added, but the two competing theories are that the blue represents veins, or it's a patriotic touch. I'm going with the latter. Leave it to Americans to put red, white, and blue on everything. I do think it looks nice though. So, when you see barber poles today, you can think of them as a living fossil, an advertising sign that outlived the medical practice that created it. They're a trade sign that survived even after the barber surgeon era faded away. Once surgery decouples from barbering and becomes its own profession, barbering has to redefine itself, moving from medical procedures to grooming, hygiene, and community, back to its roots, full circle. Barbering in the 19th century and in the early 20th century in the US moved towards licensing boards, inspections, exams, and sanitation standards, not as a sudden change like a flip of a switch, but as the consequence of barbering becoming a regulated public-facing service. Why was there a need for regulatory measures on barbering? Seems like if you learned how to cut hair and shave faces, you should be able to work as a barber, or even open up your own shop, right? Well, that's how it had been for a long time, through apprenticeships, learning on the job from a mentor. But health reformers noticed that barbershops were a perfect setting to transmit infectious diseases. Barbers worked in close physical contact with many customers in rapid succession, using shared tools that were often not properly sterilized between uses. A simple nick from a blade could infect someone with syphilis or something. And when a barber was not properly trained, the risk of infection or injury increased. Not only was there concern about the razors, but also the towels, sponges, combs, and brushes being repeatedly used on customers. These were suspected of spreading skin diseases, including barber's itch, a form of ringworm. It was a real public health issue. These health concerns pushed states to create boards requiring training for barbers and sanitation inspections for barber shops. The goal was to reduce injury and prevent the spread of disease while standardizing competence. Labor organization began with the formation of the Barbers' Protective Union in 1886. The union helped raise wages, limit apprentice exploitation, standardize hours, and improve workplace conditions for barbers facing industrial-era competition and long hours. Then came another major regulatory milestone. In 1897, Minnesota passed the first barber licensing law, which enacted statutory rules requiring aspiring barbers to pass an exam, register with a state board, hold a permit, and meet sanitary and educational standards. This license requirement functioned like an occupational certification, like a therapist license or a real estate license. Every state today requires a barber license, but Minnesota was the first to do it. Do you want to know which state was the last to require a statewide barber license? Alabama, in 2013. That's nuts. So, to recap, barbers organized first by forming a union to protect their wages and training. Then states began to codify barbering as a licensed trade, creating exam boards to enforce sanitary and educational standards. By the 1920s, barbering was no longer just a trade that was passed down. It's a profession trying to standardize itself. State boards published training guides, including national textbooks that taught sanitation, ethics, and business practices alongside shaving and haircutting techniques. In 1926, the National Association of Barber Boards of America formed, specifically to maintain those standards. Everything from exam procedures to curricula, linking state licensing into a more cohesive nationwide system. Barber schools, or barber colleges, had been around since the 1890s, but it was in the 20s that national standardization across all schools took form. While all these changes were happening, barbering in Black communities was experiencing its own set of changes. Black barbers and Black-owned barbershops carry a long history shaped by slavery, emancipation, and segregation. Under slavery, Black barbers in the South, freed or enslaved, were frequently tied to white clientele. After emancipation, Black-owned shops still served prominent white clients, but they also began serving Black customers. Over the early 20th century, segregation and the growth of Black urban neighborhoods increasingly pulled Black barbers toward Black clientele, and the barbershop's role as a community sanctuary became more central. Regulation on barbering also affected Black barbers. As states required formal training and licensing, the overall number of African American barbers declined, in part because these new requirements changed who could enter and stay in the trade. Competition from white men entering the field also contributed to this decline. Even so, African American barbershops continued to serve as a community meeting place and refuge, and played important roles in civil rights movements. That's how we got that really cool classic Black barbershop, a business that became a sanctuary for Black communities. After World War II, the number of barbershops in America skyrocketed. By 1950, there were hundreds of thousands of small, locally owned barbershops across the country. A big reason why we picture a classic barbershop as being set in the 50s is because that was the peak of modern barbershops. But why did they blow up like that? There were many contributing factors. Returning GIs, rising wages, and broad consumer confidence produced more discretionary spending on personal grooming and more frequent haircuts. The GI generation's emphasis on neat, short hairstyles kept demand high and steady. Also, barbering has a low barrier to entry, requiring relatively modest equipment and space, an attractive career option for many people, including veterans, immigrants, and entrepreneurs alike. The social, community-building aspect helped barbershop's popularity too, of course. But also, mid-century America had many small towns dotted across rural areas, as well as dense urban neighborhoods, each needing at least one local barber. So the layout of towns and neighborhoods also contributed to the barbershop boom. If you know anything about booms, you know what follows them. A bust. The rise of suburbia and haircutting franchises eroded the old city neighborhood and small-town Main Street model that was vital to the success and ubiquity of barbershops. The number of seasoned barbers began to drop as well, replaced by less experienced unisex haircutters. From the mid-1900s to the turn of the century, barbershops went from hundreds of thousands to just tens of thousands in just those 50 years. After the big post-mid-modern drop, the barbershops that endured were the ones that weren't just service counters. They were third places, community connecting points, safe social spaces, the kind of place people returned to for conversation as much as the cut. When barbershops stopped being the default place to go, they had to rebrand themselves to compete for attention. In the early 2000s, there was a barbershop revival built around specialization and customer experience. Classic cuts, beard work, and premium services like the hot towels and straight razor shaves became differentiators. The classic barbershop vibe itself became part of the product that customers were drawn to. Since the 2000s, there's been an uptick in barbershop numbers for the simple reason that they offer a luxury service, an experience that you can't find anywhere else. I love that barbershops are still with us. A lot of trades disappear completely against so much cultural change. Barbershops were threatened by a number of things, as I've discussed, but there was another threat that I have been saving for last. And that threat was at-home grooming products. It started with King C. Gillette, Mr. Gillette himself, who patented a practical double-edged disposable blade safety razor in 1904 and built a mass production business around cheap replaceable blades for home use. Then, large military contracts in World War I exposed millions of men to the convenience of disposable blades and normalized at-home shaving going forward, reducing reliance on barbers for routine shaving. Then came the clippers. Electric clippers spread quickly in the 1920s as professional tools, helping barbers work faster and more efficiently. But when the technology of clippers and trimmers shifted toward consumers, visits to the barber became less frequent. Safety razors, clippers, and trimmers unbundled the grooming services of barbershops, and what survived was everything you can't find on a store shelf: the skill, the style, and the experience. The history of barbering is a human one. Managing our hair has always been important to us in terms of identity, faith, health, and belonging. Barbers have helped humanity express itself, strengthening social, political, and religious systems by simply cutting hair. It occurred to me, though, that barbering survives an ever-changing world because it has never only been about hair. It's a cultural institution that keeps finding new ways to hold space for people. Conversation, human connection, and community is what keeps the barbershop from disappearing. So even after safety razors and other at-home tools made grooming more private and convenient, the barbershop persisted because it offered what convenience can't: a familiar third place where you know you belong. And that's the origin story of barbershops. I have one last fun fact for you. I haven't had a haircut since 2008. And it's not because I have the longest head of hair in the world. It's because of genetics. So I shave it. Does that make me my own barber? No. But now I'm super inspired to go get a professional shave at one of the many barbershops in my town. They're everywhere again. It's great. Well, that's it for today. If you have a barber, you should totally share this episode with them. I think it would make them feel even more proud of being a barber than I'm sure they already do. What a cool career choice. All right, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you right back here in a couple of weeks for another deep dive into the origin of another random topic. Until next time, so long. Research, music, and production was all done by Jezere Wilson. This podcast is listener-supported, owned and operated by Jez and myself under the On the Origin of Everything, LLC in the United States. All rights reserved. We can be reached via email at info@ontheoriginpod.com.